This is Jed Distler, and welcome to the Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. I would like to thank all of you who have subscribed and joined me on this journey that we started 1 year ago in July of 2024. And I've been enjoying your feedback and your own recommendations for recordings. And even though I say that this is a guide to piano recordings, you are guiding me quite often. We are guiding each other. And we've been sharing our passions and our obsessions. And I'm constantly learning and discovering music and recordings and performers in the process. If you are new to the Piano Maven, please consider taking out a subscription. And there's a link to do so in our episode description. So for this first anniversary episode of the Piano Maven, I thought that I could take a large-scale and very familiar work like the 24 Preludes Opus 28 by Frédéric Chopin, and that I would come up with 24 pianists who have recorded the cycle of 24 preludes. Several of these pianists have recorded the cycle on more than one occasion, as you will find out. And because this is such an important and iconic piece, I'm going to talk about the work a little bit first and give you some background information. Let's go back to 1838, when a writer whose name was Aurore Amantine Dupin-Dudevant, better known by her male pen name of Georges Sand, traveled to the island of Majorca with her 2 children and her boyfriend, who was the composer Frédéric Chopin. And this was intended to be a romantic getaway of sorts, but the trip turned out to be an utter disaster because they wound up having really shabby lodgings, and the weather was so awful and rainy and cold that it wound up aggravating Chopin's already serious tubercular condition. In fact, several doctors on the island came to examine Chopin and all basically said, "Sorry, Frederick, you're going to die." And also, Chopin had expected to have access to a decent piano, but that didn't happen. So during their stay in Majorca, Chopin still managed to complete his Preludes Opus 28. And I suspect that the work's volatile changes in mood and character from one piece to another may well have a kind of autobiographical subtext in terms of this ill-fated vacation. But I think more importantly, the preludes represent a microcosm of Chopin's style and his aesthetic on several levels. Its very structure, for instance, reflects Chopin's deep love and regard for Johann Sebastian Bach, particularly the Well-Tempered Clavier. And the Bach preludes and fugues of the Well-Tempered Clavier encompass all 24 major and minor keys, as do Chopin's 24 preludes. Now, Bach organizes the preludes and fugues by chromatically ascending half steps, meaning that first you have a prelude and fugue in C major, and then a prelude and fugue in C minor, and then one in C sharp major, and then C sharp minor, D major, D minor, etc., etc. You see, you're going up chromatically. But Chopin establishes a different scheme based on the circle of fifths. And if you are not a musician, I'll try to explain this as clearly as I can. The first of the Chopin preludes is in C major, and then the second is in A minor, which goes down a third of an interval from C major to its relative minor key of A minor. And then for number 3, Chopin ascends a perfect fifth up from C major to G major. And then again, number 4 is in the relative minor of G major, which is the key of E minor. And this pattern continues for the remaining preludes. Like number 5 is D major, and that is up a perfect fifth from the G major. And then you have B minor, the relative minor of D major, and so on and so forth. And this pattern of keys, now this isn't exactly an original idea of Chopin, because Johann Nepomuk Hummel did the same thing. He used the same kind of harmonic pattern in his set of 24 preludes, Opus 67, that was composed in 1815. And it uses this exact circle of fifths template. And I know that Chopin was familiar with this piece. There doesn't seem to be any evidence that Chopin performed all 24 preludes as a cycle. And it only was, I guess, in the later part of the 19th century where pianists did begin to play all 24 preludes as a continuous cycle. I think the piece definitely works as such, and it usually is heard that way now. So let's talk about recordings of all 24 preludes as a cycle. And as I said earlier, I've selected 24 pianists who've recorded the 24 preludes as a cycle. I should say that even beyond the 24 pianists who I've picked, there are still fantastic recorded versions out there. I mean, when it comes to the Preludes Opus 28, we are really spoiled for choice. We've been spoiled for choice for almost 100 years, starting in 1926, 99 years ago, when Alfred Cortot made the first commercial recording of the Preludes Opus 28. He probably holds the record for the most studio recordings of the Preludes made by one pianist. His first integral commercial recording was from 1926, and he would go on to record the cycle 3 more times in the studio. His 1934 recording is probably my favorite of the 4. First of all, it's better sonically, and he's on better technical form than in 1926. The 1942 version he recorded in France is less well engineered, and it's less well played. And we're not going to talk about the unpublished 1957 studio recording that EMI did finally publish in their 40-disc Alfred Cortot anniversary box set. But it's the 1934 recording where Cortot conveys drama and ecstasy and poetry in every bar of music. And he has that ability to create a totally different character for each piece, just through like subtle changes of sound. And he has this ability, he always did, to hit upon just the right tempo. Now, a less intense yet maybe more aristocratic point of view with even more technical refinement comes from Benno Moiseiwicz, whose 1949 HMV recording of the Chopin Preludes has always been on the top of my list. And he offers some interesting textual variants. For instance, in the 7th prelude, he plays an altered version of one measure where the melody is distinctly different from what we normally hear. He uses the Carl Klindworth edition. So instead of da 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 dum bum bum, he goes da 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 dum bum. I mean, I can't remember exactly what it is because I'm recording this really early in the morning and I'm too lazy to take my score out. Another recording from the 78 era doesn't get talked about often when recordings of the Preludes are discussed. And this is the 1946 recording by Arthur Rubinstein. He didn't think very highly of this, and it's never been a recording that has had the critical consensus that distinguishes Rubinstein's other Chopin recordings. Like his waltzes have always had a critical consensus about them, and the mazurkas, for example. But returning to the Preludes, I hadn't heard them in a while, and I really like the vehement and angular and anti-sentimental vantage point that he brings to this music. It kind of reminds me of how Arthur Schnabel treated Beethoven. There's none of the surface charm that you normally get from Rubinstein. So in this sense, it's rather atypical of his Chopin. Actually, his 1949 nocturnes are cut from similar cloth, I would say. But Rubinstein's Chopin Preludes, I think, really deserve revisiting for sure. Now, I wish that the 1949 Guillemard Novaes Chopin Preludes on the Vox label could be remastered and reissued, because these are wonderful and very individual accounts with all kinds of alluring voicings and nuances. It's very creative and subjective playing, but it's always in the spirit of Chopin. You have to hear these recordings if you can find them. Just don't take my word for it. There is a live Chopin Preludes that Music and Arts published with Guillemard Novaes, but the sound quality is not very good, unfortunately. But try to find these studio recordings of Novaes and the Preludes. And there's another underrated and overlooked, yet technically really excellent and musically fresh interpretation that came out in the early 50s on the Decca label with Friedrich Gulda. This is really, really worth hearing. I'm going to skip over some other Chopin Preludes recordings from the 1950s so that I can get to the 1960s. Geza Anda on Deutsche Grammophon features impressive pianistic refinement and pinpointed detail in his finger work. He tended to be a pianist who was more into little details rather than being a pianist interested in the big picture. And I think that works out really well for the Preludes. Ivan Moravec on Connoisseur Society. This is a really marvelous recording. And he tends to treat each piece as a cameo miniature, almost like a Fabergé egg, for lack of a better analogy. And I guess the word refinement is really appropriate here. I ever so slightly prefer these 1960s recordings to his still excellent and stylistically similar 1970s remake on Supraphon, which is the one that you can readily obtain. Now, the 1960s versions were available on the VAI label on CD, and that disc is rather hard to find, unfortunately. But if you do find it and you don't have to spend a fortune, definitely grab it. Now we are going to get to the classic reference versions of the Chopin Preludes Opus 28 from the 1970s. Now, it's kind of simplistic to say that Maurizio Pollini is Apollonian and Martha Argerich is Dionysiac, but that pretty much sums up their brilliant and musicianly and totally antipodal approaches. Perhaps Murray Pariah's version from that same era splits the difference. Now, again, I'm simplifying here. But in the company of Argerich, Pollini, and Pariah, there was another marvelous version that tended to fall in between the cracks, and that was Vladimir Ashkenazy's recording. And this is a red-blooded and passionate account, but at the same time, it's quite scrupulous in regard to the text. Now, also from the 1970s, we had Claudio Arrau, which is very highly rhetorical and inflected, but what a golden tone he had, an extraordinary finish to the pianism. And this is a more colorful and subjective and emotionally convincing interpretation than the one that Arrau recorded in the late 1940s for Columbia, which I did not mention earlier. There's another 1970s version that was not approved for release at the time of its recording. This is with Rudolf Serkin. I think he recorded this in 1975, and it did come out after his death. And the booklet notes of the original release said that Serkin had, quote-unquote, good reason not to sanction its release. Actually, I think it was recorded in 1976. I have to look. Anyway, it was around that time. But I don't know why Serkin did not approve its release. Maybe there were one or two smudges, but who really cares? Because this is such interesting and wonderful playing. I mean, Serkin's forceful and unvarnished and angular interpretation is very much in the mode of the Arthur Rubinstein recording. And like many pianists of his generation, Serkin is not averse to breaking his hands, playing the left hand before the right hand for melodic emphasis and textural variety. And you hear him do that in the simpler lyrical preludes. But at the same time, Serkin does not give you many of the so-called traditional rubatos and phrasing conventions. One example of that is in the 17th prelude, the A-flat prelude. Those introductory measures, bum 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 bum, before the tune comes in, bum ba 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 do 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 do. Of course, I'm singing it too fast. Now, most pianists make a retard at the end of those chords, ba 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 ba. Then the melody. So they do ba 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 da dee doo doo dee doo. But Serkin does not make a retard on those chords. And neither does Friedrich Gulda, for that matter. So you hear ba 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 da 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 da. And it gives that melody a different kind of emphasis. Now, I don't mean to harp so much on those details, but this is something that is kind of interesting. Now, by playing number 18 in tempo with almost little rubato and no melodrama, those unison octave outbursts have much more of a stinging impact than usual with Rudolf Serkin. And he brings really strong power and clarity in the 8th and 16th and 19th and 24th preludes. And even at that point in his career, when Serkin was 70 or in his early 70s, he could still rise to and vanquish virtuosic challenges like no one else. Now, before moving on to some more recent versions of the preludes that I've enjoyed, I should mention that Ashkenazy and Pollini remade the preludes later on. Ashkenazy re-recorded the preludes in the early 1990s, and these are larger-scaled interpretations than the ones he did in the 70s. They're grander and more daring in some ways, with more contrasts in articulation. But on the other hand, Pollini's 2011 remake is more austere and less inflected and even impatient sometimes in the lyrical pieces. I really prefer his 1970s version over the remake. Oh, I also forgot to mention that Garrick Olson recorded the preludes twice. He recorded them in the 1970s, around the same time as Argerich and Pollini and Arau and Ashkenazy. These are good recordings, but I think his remakes for Arabesque are much, much better. And they have much more flexibility and dynamic contrasts and color and poetry. They're really, really fine readings of the preludes. And this came out on Arabesque, and it was reissued on Hyperion in the complete Chopin Works cycle by Garrick Olson. Definitely check that out. One Chopin prelude cycle from the 1980s 80s that never got the attention that it deserved is one with the young Jean-Yves Thibaudet. I think he recorded it in 1987 for Denon in Japan. And these are colorful, impetuous, and thoughtfully detailed and technically marvelous readings. And it's also very well recorded. I hadn't thought about the April 2001 recording on the Erato label by Nikolai Lugansky in quite a long time. But I took it out again and listened again, and I really like it a lot, much more than I did many years ago. This interpretation really personifies the Russian romantic tradition at its best, meaning broad tempos for the A major and E major and F major preludes. And then you get terrific speed and precision in virtuoso pieces like the G major, F sharp minor, and B flat minor preludes. There's a lot of rhetorical inflection, but it's never extreme. Now, sometimes his fast finger work can be on the glib side, but this is masterful pianism without any doubt. And in a similar vein, the live Daniil Trifonov recording on Deutsche Grammophon from his Carnegie Hall debut recital is stylistically similar, although maybe there's more audacity in his interpretation, and it is better recorded. Now, for totally arresting subjectivity and real audacity and boundless creative imagination, here is a Chopin Preludes cycle that I think really walks on the wild side, and that's the Sony classical recording with Cyprian Katsaris. Now, he almost makes Cortot sound like Pollini. I mean, this is such crazy playing, but you cannot help but get drawn into this sound world. I mean, Katsaris has charisma up the wazoo. His recording of the Preludes is one of my guilty pleasures. I suppose that the Cyprian Katsaris Chopin Preludes relates in the same way that his mentor Georges Chiffre related to the Chopin Etudes. Now, I wouldn't make Katsaris your first choice, but once you get to know this music from a relatively straightforward version, you will really appreciate Katsaris. At least I hope you will. I just have so much fun listening to this recording. But for a subjective approach minus the borderline eccentricity, I want to draw your attention to the two live recordings published with Grigory Sokolov. The first one was from 1990, and I think it was first released on a label called Opus 111. I know it appeared on the Naive label later on. I honestly can't keep track of this recording's various incarnations. But it's very compelling, and the pianism has extraordinary finish to it. And then there is the Sokolov 2008 performance from the Salzburg Festival, released on Deutsche Grammophon. And I prefer the 2008 performance in several respects. I think the closer microphone placement gives more edge to the accents, so that pieces like the G major, F sharp minor, and E flat preludes seem more specific, I guess, in regard to the linear contours. But there are pianistic differences too, like Sokolov uses less pedal and he gives crisper articulation in 2008 to the B-flat minor prelude, and he's more direct and less stretched out in the B-flat major than he was in 1990. But still, I would recommend hearing both of these recordings, and I think I had written in a review that his interpretation was something of a more intellectualized version of Argerich's impulsive interpretation. I don't know if I still agree with what I wrote. But look, hear these two recordings for yourself, and I would be curious to see what you think. Now, I'd like to talk about several recent Chopin Preludes editions that I've really enjoyed. In 2013, Christian Budu became the first Brazilian pianist to win the International Clara Haskell competition. And one byproduct of his victory was his solo piano CD released on the Claves label that included the Chopin Preludes. And he brings a personal voice and a strong point of view to the Preludes. He conveys really passionate sweep, but also great clarity in the first Prelude's shifts of texture. And the second Prelude, I just re-listened to it. At first, it seems like it's kind of slow and straitjacketed, boo doo 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 doo. I mean, nowhere near as slow as Sergio Fiorentino's recording. But the carefully built up dynamic plan intensifies the very disturbing dissonances. And these dissonances in the second Prelude still are very disturbing today. And there's a real dry lightness to the fifth Prelude's cross rhythms, and number 10 has a lot of audacity to it. Those cascading runs just bolt out of the starting gate, followed by an abrupt slamming of the brakes. I just re-listened to number 16, and I noticed how Budu takes those 6 opening chords, da 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 dum. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, those were 6 chords. He makes this unwritten crescendo underneath them. Chopin didn't write that, but it's quite an effect. I had never heard that from anyone else, or if I did hear it from someone else, I didn't remember. But it's a very, very interesting and compelling interpretation. Some people may like Ingrid Flitter's recording of the Preludes on the Lynn label more than I do. They're very beautifully played, and there's a lot of refinement to her pianism. I kind of find the recording inconsistent because I feel that she underplays some of the earlier ones in the set, and she drags out that B minor Prelude number 6. Da, ba, 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 bong. Well, I'm exaggerating her tempo, but it never seems to end. And that raindrop Prelude just gets thicker and heavier as it unfolds. I think I wrote in a review that her raindrops are turning into oobleck. The Dr. Seuss story of Bartholomew and the oobleck, when instead of rain, you're getting this new invention called oobleck, where everything is sticking to the ground and, you're getting stuck in the oobleck and you can't walk. Well, those are the raindrops in Ingrid Flitter's recording. But the way that she plays number 18, it's one of the most electrifying renditions of this Prelude I've ever heard. I mean, wow, talk about adrenaline revival. She's made some very compelling recordings, in all fairness, of Chopin. I love her Chopin waltzes, which are really delightfully old-school interpretations. They're just irresistible. I like her Chopin B minor sonata a lot. And there's some live recordings that VAI issued of Chopin that I think are terrific. Her nocturnes, I don't like as much as other people do. I think they're kind of meh. But anyway, she's a serious artist, and do check out her Preludes. Maybe you will like them more than I do. Now, on the Zigzag Territories label, there's a recording with Andrew Tyson, and I talked about him recently on this podcast, calling him the Willy Wonka of pianists, and that is a compliment from me, because I think he's a brilliant pianist and he has a great mind and he's always taking chances and he's never uninteresting. And I remember in the booklet notes of Andrew Tyson's Chopin Preludes, he talks about the tension between spontaneity and craft that runs through these pieces. And pianists generally are able to reconcile these characteristics, whether you are a free spirit like Cortot or Moiseyevich or Argerich, or if you are classically oriented like Pollini and Gulda and Sirkin and Ashkenazi. But sometimes Tyson crosses that thin and fragile line between individuality and eccentricity, but he's always interesting. So you got to give him propers for that. However, I think a pianist who really achieves an ideal fusion of impassioned ardor and classical textual rigor is Wolfram Schmidt-Leonardi on the brilliant Classics label. I think it came out on Piano Classics also. But I remember when I reviewed this for classicstoday.com, I got so involved in details, and I just wrote a very long review of this. I got really carried away with chapter and verse. I think I did so because I was just so fascinated by what he was doing, and I recommend that you read my original review of this because I'm not going to go into great detail here, but I've posted a link to my review, and so you can hear all of these details for yourself. I think this is a really terrific recording that hasn't been talked about very much, but it ranks among my top favorite Chopin Preludes recordings, certainly among the more recent versions out there. And then on Harmonia Mundi, I've always liked the Alexandre Tarot recording. He takes the first Prelude's agitato directive and he just simply runs away with it. But he makes the right hand's triplet and quintuplet groupings very distinctly audible. And I like his interpretation of number 12. This is very interesting. You know, the G sharp minor. You know, most pianists drive through the first big climax, which is at measure 21 if you have the score. But what Tarot does is really interesting. He kind of leans into the grace notes in order to underline the music's momentary mazurka-like feeling. And this is a very odd and unconventional, yet very convincing effect. And I don't know why other pianists haven't noticed that little tiny mazurka inserted in the middle of this prelude. And in the B-flat prelude, number 21, which is often treated as a lyrical, expansive piece, it has an unusually forward-moving urgency in Tarot's interpretation that just dovetails easily into number 22, which is totally agitated. I think it's a really, really distinctive interpretation. There's only one tiny weak moment, which is a little bit of a hesitation at one point in the 10th prelude in the descending right-hand runs. But look, it really doesn't matter. This is a terrific Chopin Preludes. However, if I had to make a top recommendation among all of the recent versions that I was just talking about, it would be the recording on the Alpha label by Behzad Abdurrahimov. And his stellar technique and his intelligent musicianship and his feeling for tonal nuance stand out in every piece. Not only does he nail number 3's difficult left-hand runs, but he shades them very subtly, and he gives amazing cross-rhythmic definition to number 5. Number 8, there's a real shimmer to the very elaborate textures. It's just so transparent and clear, but the music still moves and it still has passion. And his fleetness and poise in such virtuoso showpieces like number 16 and 19 and 22 and 24, I think are very close to the classicism of the 1974 Pollini recording, but there's a little more dynamism and passion to them, I think. But there is so much color and authority to Abdurrahimov's playing that you really can't ignore it. This is one of the finest versions of the Chopin Preludes, really from any generation. So there we have it, 24 pianists. Alfred Cortot, Benno Moiseievich, Arthur Rubinstein, Guillemar Novaes, Fruja Gulda, Geza Anda, Ivan Moravec, who recorded it twice, Maurizio Pollini, who recorded it twice, Martha Argerich, Vladimir Ashkenazy, who recorded it twice, Claudio Arau has 2 studio recordings, Rudolf Serkin, Garrick Olson, who recorded it twice in the studio, Jean-Yves Thibaudet, Nikolai Lugansky, Daniil Trifonov, Cyprian Koutsaris, Grigory Sokolov, who recorded it twice officially, Christian Boudou, Ingrid Flitter, Andrew Tyson, Wolfram Schmidt-Leonardi, Alexandra Tarot, and Bezad Abduraimov. 24 pianists in recordings of the 24 Preludes, Opus 28 by Frédéric Chopin. So which one would I recommend out of all of these? I honestly can't say. I think all of these are really worth hearing, and I will leave it to you to explore this vast treasure trove of recordings. This is Jed Disler, and you've been listening to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. Thank you so much for tuning into this podcast episode, and I look forward to being with you next time.